Okay, everyone, I think we can get started. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event hosted by the Department of Political Science at Carleton University in Ottawa with our guest speaker, Pippa Norris from Harvard University. Even though this is an online event, I do want to notice that we are hosting this event from the campus of Carleton University, which is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. We are very pleased to have with us today one of the most well-known, most prolific, most cited political scientists in the world, Pippa Norris, who, as I mentioned already, is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she holds the Paul F. McGuire Lecturer position in comparative politics. Pippa, as most of the people in the audience will know, is a scholar of democracy, public opinion, elections, political communications, as well as gender and politics. Topics on which she has written around 50 books, that's 50. So in contrast to most other introductions, I will not read the titles of all the books, but I will just mention, as you can see when Pippa will speak on the left-hand side of your screen, the most recent publication, the most recent book that she has published, In Praise of Skepticism, from 2022. But I'm also very pleased that today we have a chance to get kind of a sneak preview of the next book that Pippa is working on, which is on democratic backsliding and set to come out sometime in the second half of next year, as I understand. So I think without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Pippa Norris. And after her talk, there will be the opportunity to ask questions either through the Q&A or by raising your hand and unmuting yourself and asking a question directly. So let's get this started. And Pippa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you so much for the invitation. And in particular, of course, this is a topic which is of such relevance to every single place around the world. I think that very much is what why we have a great audience. And Canada actually seems one of the exceptions, which is interesting in terms of human rights and liberal democracy. I always think of it at the forefront of some of these developments, along, of course, with many other places, such as Norway, Sweden, and so on. So what are we talking about when we're talking about this topic? Let's look at the slides. And what I'd like to do is to emphasize that this is work in progress. It's going to be finished over spring. And clearly, current developments continue to evolve. And so we have to bring into account current events as well as the research which is available. And it's about culture and the cultural roots of democratic backsliding. And all the details can be available at the, you can contact me and you can find things about it on Twitter. So first, what I'm going to do is talk about the theory. And democratic backsliding is not simply any form of democratic decline. For example, you can have a coup d'etat, which is a dramatic change, as we've seen in the Sahel region of Africa. You can see the classic changes which occur with other types of events. Backsliding is a more gradual process. And so we really need to understand what's going on. It's an erosion of many, sometimes long-established democracies or young democracies, which go back towards authoritarianism. And in particular, I'm going to argue that there are different views about what's causing this. And I think we're better at describing it so far in the initial literature than really understanding it and explaining it. We'll talk about the global rise of authoritarian populism, which draws on my previous work with Ron Inglehart, and then the consequences. Does it matter when particular leaders and parties come to power? I'm going to take 4 cases, and they're very well known in terms of authoritarian populism: Hungary under Viktor Orban, India under Modi, Brazil under Bolsonaro, and then, of course, the case of the United States under Trump, about which we continue to see all sorts of developments, and the conclusions and implications. So what's the argument going to be? Firstly, I think there's good evidence now that we can see a clear rise in authoritarian populist leaders and parties worldwide in recent decades. And this, I think, sometimes can get overblown. But I think if we look at some of the best evidence, we can see, for example, that the share of the vote going to a wide range of parties that might fall under this category in Europe and in other types of liberal democracies is about 30%, which is very high. We can see a rise in the number of leaders worldwide. But is the impact on democratic backsliding exaggerated? What I'm going to argue is that what particularly matters is the length of time in office. When they come in for one term, then democracies can be resilient. And indeed, international idea has demonstrated a lot about how democracies can come back, particularly because there's strong democratic norms and values in the heart of culture, which is very slow to change. However, the problems occur when these leaders and parties come back over successive terms of office. And then the risks increase as those who are more authoritarian manage to use the capacity of the state to weaken elections, to weaken public trust in things like the independent media, to produce corruption and erode rule of law, and a variety of other institutional changes which are much more difficult to reverse. But that in itself doesn't tell us much that's new in a way. That's exactly what so many people have been arguing in recent years. I think we have to understand, however, that leaders are a consequence as much as a cause. And indeed, we often in America blame Trump for so much of the current problems in liberal democracy, but we know that some of the problems, of course, have been occurring for many years and indeed decades. Things like the shift in the Republican Party did not start with Donald Trump, and they probably won't end with Donald Trump. Say if he stood down for any reason from the nomination process, we're likely to find other candidates in the party and other politicians and other leaders who will follow on in that tradition. So we have to understand the reasons for growing party polarization. And again, some books which have looked at democratic backsliding just start there and say, okay, there's party polarization. What difference does it make for example, how legislation is passed? But we need to know why parties are polarized. And again, when we take the United States as a case, the Republicans, after all, used to be a fairly moderate party on the center right. They, in fact, used to be quite open on a number of different issues. If you think back to the 1960s and 70s, there were politicians who were leading the party who were in favor of reproductive rights, who were in favor very much of migration and immigration. Think about George Bush, for example, or who were interested in issues of expanding welfare as well. But what's happened is, of course, the party over a long period has moved gradually to the right in Congress and in the base. And there are weak institutional checks on the executive, which are structural flaws, not just individual flaws. And the media fragmentation is another factor which has led to these leaders. And polarization, however, even can't stop with the institutions. We have to understand the culture. And in particular, is there growing support in society, in mass society, for authoritarian values and for strongman leaders, those who promise order and stability, those who promise to protect traditional values, those who argue that if you elect me, I'll speak for you and restore some of the ways in which we used to work in the past. So all of these are key points. I think the first two are less contentious, but the reasons and the arguments why these developments are occurring really needs much more documentation and research. So the book itself starts with these three questions. Firstly, what's the severity and scope of democratic backsliding worldwide? And again, because there's been so much work done on that, you might assume that it's a settled question, that we all know that democracies worldwide are under threat. But even though there's a lot of good work by the Variety of Democracy project and by those like Larry Diamond and many others as well, saying that yes, there are threats. Nevertheless, recently there's been a more strong debate, pushing back on that, about the universality of these developments and the measures which are used. And so, for example, Little and Meng have argued if we take a more Schumpeterian view of democracy, there hasn't been a greater change in, for example, whether or not elections see electoral turnover. And Tom Carruthers has argued in foreign policy and a number of other places that essentially we're exaggerating some of the problems. We sit in the United States and we try to project onto the rest of the world some of these developments. Or we think about Europe and we think about the challenges which exist from the rise of populist parties in Germany, in Sweden, in Hungary, and so on. But again, Tom Carruthers, who's one of the most experienced watchers of democracy worldwide and always has been for many years, says that we should really take a much broader perspective and understand that there are some bright spots on the horizon, some cases which have moved forward, other cases have moved backwards. The second question which it addresses is what's the drivers of any decline? And as I said, I think that we're on less firm ground even here. In particular, there are many, which is exemplified by Larry Bartell's new book, where he argues that elites are the driving factors. He says that democracy, in the title of the book, erodes from the top. And the opposite view, in contrast to that, is instead there are some developments in mass culture. Things like tolerance, the ways in which people are intolerant of those from different countries, different religions, different backgrounds, the intolerance in terms of race and ethnicity, or issues of trust, institutional trust, for example, in the main pillars of liberal democracy, or changes which are just there in terms of support for the major parties on the centre left and centre right, and the willingness to be much more volatile in the electorate and to vote for minor parties with much less stability. So I think that this debate between the role of leaders and the role of culture is ongoing. And again, it's something that we need to think through quite hard with a lot of good evidence to work it out. Is it that Trump is leading to MAGA? Or is it that essentially the Republican Party has been captured by its base in terms of primaries and in terms of the nomination process, such that the old centre-right, those like Mitt Romney and others who are standing in his footsteps, can't actually get any support in that party? And then the third question is the most difficult one of all. And this is one which I do not pretend to answer. I can certainly give some options, but what's the effective strategies and actions to mitigate the risks and strengthen democracy? And there's an awful lot of people who have a single notion of, here's a reform that if we just introduce this, everything else will change. In the United States, again, we can think about ranked choice voting. It's become very popular, and various initiatives in different states. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. And so we can look at, for example, Biden's Summit for Democracy, an attempt now which has been meeting with partners around the world, which is a very open debate, and different countries have pledged to do different things to strengthen their own democracy, to push back on authoritarianism. But I think we need to think more systematically, not just let a thousand flowers bloom, but think about what we know about the drivers of this from earlier eras. And in this regard, I particularly think about the work of Aaron Leiphart, one of the most influential institutionalists of our time, and Johan Lintz, a classic political sociologist, a student of Latin America, and their argument about power sharing institutional reforms and certain forms of design are the ones which are weakest and open to democratic backsliding. So that's what the book, that's the map of the book. And I obviously won't give you everything because we have a short time, but I'll give you a snapshot of some of the early parts. First, what we need to do is clearly think about what is democratic backsliding. And the concept came about partly because of Nancy Bermio's work. And she started to identify some of these tendencies in an influential article in the Journal of Democracy. And she said the type of ways in which democracies are declining is not the same as it used to be. There are new forms, and it looks often like countries remain democratic. They have elections, but the elections are eroding in quality. It looks like they have a strong independent parliament, but in fact, executive powers are expanding. It looks like they might support human rights formally, but in practice, the norms are being weakened. And many others have taken up that idea. And so what we need is some sort of indicator of the measure of democratic backsliding worldwide. So what I've done is a very simple measure here. It's essentially the net change. It's the Liberal Democracy Index, which is provided by the Variety of Democracy project based in the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And I've taken the scale which they give you, which is 1 to 100 in 2000. And again, in 2022, you take one from the other, and that's a clear summary of the 21st century, the decline. And it's obviously a little bit arbitrary. If I took a different period, for example, if I started in 2025, or in particular, if I started in 1990, or even when the third wave started in the 1970s, I'd get obviously a very different picture. But most of the scholars do agree that around the 2000-2005 era was when these new waves of backsliding seemed to start. So it seemed a reasonable proposition. And it's not a complicated measure. It's one which everybody can get, and these are color-coded. So if you were an audience in front of me, the first thing I'd say to you is what's going on here. And I know many of you might come from different countries and with different experiences. So the first thing is clearly we can find those cases which have deteriorated a lot during this period. When you look at the map, the red countries, for example, so look at Poland under Law and Justice. Now, that's gone down 38%. On the other hand, the fascinating thing is that Law and Justice has just been defeated. And so we're going to see if the opposition parties, when they come to power, can try to restore democracy in that country. In other words, whether it's resilient or whether it's been damaged too badly in a number of different ways. Hungary, 42%. That's a major change. We all know that. Viktor Orban came to power essentially in 2010 when he changed the electoral system to benefit Fidesz, his party. And after that, the opposition parties there have tried through successive elections to displace him as leader and as party in government. But he has a supermajority which allows him to do very much what he wants to do. And his pushback on migration policy in Europe, his pushback on human rights is now very favorable towards Russia. And the last election, very recently, didn't manage to get rid of Viktor Orban. He's popular at home. And the electoral system reinforces his popularity. Again, let's look at the map and let's look at, for example, Turkey. Erdogan, 32% decline, very sharp. And remember, there was an attempted coup d'etat in 2016, which didn't work. But after that, Erdogan used it to consolidate his power and to assert, in particular for his rural base, a strong leadership against the traditional groups that are always in matters of tension in Turkey, i.e. the Kurds, but also tightening up on freedom of the press, tightening up on academic freedom. Some of our scholars, some of our friends were no longer able to teach in universities. And then when we look more broadly, we can see India, minus 29%, that's under Modi. And we can see some other Asian countries which are having problems in Southeast Asia in particular. We can see countries in Africa. Now, I think this is out of date in the sense that we need to take account of the recent coup d'etats. As I mentioned earlier, there has been 6 in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Sahel region. And what this has done is, in particular, in Niger, in Mali, in Benin, some of the countries that were seen as really moving forward as young democracies since 1990 have really been set back. And classic military coup d'etats have pushed back on liberal freedoms in those countries. And it's a mixed picture, as you can see in Africa. We see some countries which have moved backwards and others which have, according to VDEM, had gains in this period. And then if we look in Latin America, similarly, a mixed picture. Obviously, we can see in Venezuela, but that decline started, of course, under Chavez and then continued under Maduro. And the elections are really problematic and the opposition party has very few rights. In Brazil, the case that we're going to look at, down 22%. But as I'll show, in fact, that decline started before Bolsonaro came into power under the leadership of Lula da Silva, who's now back in power. We can see cases like Nicaragua in Central America. That's Daniel Ortega, who didn't allow certain candidates to stand in opposition. And again, a leader who came to power and there were great hopes that democracy in Nicaragua could flourish. He was part of the Sandinistas, but over time became much more corrupt and the regime became much more restrictive. And some other countries there, some of which, according to the data, again, have become more democratic, some of which haven't changed that much. Now, all of those are the patterns which are in some ways the most dramatic, but look at what happened to the United States and Canada. Now, Canada doesn't change. As I said earlier, a strong liberal democracy, if we look at the absolute levels, obviously some pressures on populism. I'd be very happy to talk and learn from you about some of the recent developments in party politics in Canada. But nevertheless, no real change. But the United States has gone down. But again, sometimes there's such a literature, so many articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and online in social media about how democracy has suffered, but it's gone down only 7% in these figures compared with many other countries around the world. Anyway, I won't go in any more detail, but this gives you a snapshot of what's happening around the world. And the clear conclusion which I draw from this, and by the way, these figures can be compared, and they're very similar if I use, say, Freedom House as a measure of democracy, or if I use Polity, or if I use the Bertelsmann Institute, or many other indicators of liberal democracy. What we can see is that there's a patchwork quilt. that some countries have clearly declined sharply and a long way, including countries which we're going to focus on, but other countries have made gains, just as Tom Carruthers argues. Sometimes countries which are not necessarily so much in the headlines as the United States. There's that center periphery bias in what we watch and what we get from the media. Sometimes gains which might be seen as modest, but nevertheless, we can see a picture which is not necessarily one of inevitable decline in every country around the world during that period. So what can we say about what's going on in all of these? Well, one thing is maybe we should focus not just on every country, maybe we should focus on the established democracies. And after all, a lot of the literature says that's where the decline has been most strong. So here we just look at, quote, Western democracies, i.e. the familiar cases of Europe, North America, Australia, etc. And what we can see is just again the change as a net change illustrated from 2000 to 2022. And we can see that Greece, according to this, has had some of the worst erosions. Remember, Greece had a party, Golden Dawn, which was found to be illegal because of the violence. They were very much part of the extreme far right in Europe. Austria, according to this, has had a decline, but the United States, out of all democracies, has also had a decline. But then some other countries have as well, each for different reasons, sometimes for particular developments. But we can also see some countries, again, in established democracies, which have gained a little bit, according to this, and some which really haven't changed at all. You have to think about the margin of error of the expert estimates. They're never going to be 100%, just like any survey. And so we can certainly say that the United States has gone down, but in worldwide terms, we need to put this in comparison. And again, we can say that in established democracies, it's not the case that every country during this period has seen a decline of democracy. No, many have stayed stable. And by the way, again, Canada is in the middle there, doesn't change, of course, along with a number of other countries around that, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Spain, etc. So this has produced a flourishing literature. And this is the sort of work which has been developed. So we have, for example, work by Cass Sunstein in the law school at Harvard. Can it happen here? Can we learn about authoritarianism? And could it be the case that in 2024, America reverts to authoritarianism, which seems unimaginable even a few years ago? We have work by those like Steve Levitsky and Dan Zimblad over in the Center for European Studies at Harvard, How Democracies Die. A dramatic title, one which was very popular. Biden was seen as carrying a book around the White House under his arm, and their more recent book focusing on the United States and how the rigidity of the Constitution has created real problems for any sort of effective reforms. It's not so much that the institutions are badly designed, but that when they are increasingly out of touch, you can't shift them very easily. Our own book on cultural backlash, which I'll draw a little bit from our work with my old colleague Ron Inglehart, Yasha Monk, who also has a new book come out, and then many other books which have been along the same lines, all about democracy in crisis, etc. Essentially, what we have to be careful of is assuming that we are chicken little and the world is crashing down, as we saw. In fact, often we're being influenced by the media and negative news in the media. Often we're influenced by particular influential cases, which are widely cited. It might not be the case that democracy is necessarily in crisis in all of these countries. So if there is a decline in some cases, which I think is unambiguous, what is the explanation? And here what I'm going to do is use the heuristic model, meaning a theoretical arrangement which seeks to determine a sequence of events and a sequence of processes that explain democratic backsliding. And this essentially is the map that I use in the book. And so we can identify agency explanations, and those focus very much on leaders and elites, and in particular books such as Larry Bartell's. And the argument here is that what you've got is a shift in those who come to power, and the reasons why they come to power is sometimes somewhat ambiguous. And particularly the amount of work which has been done trying to explain the popularity of the former President Trump, a mountain of work, and yet we're still puzzled by the fact that, for example, a leader who has 91 indictments, who's in court every other day, whose family is in court, should still have such a hold over the Republican nomination process. And the argument is that those leaders lead to changes in liberal democracy. And maybe this is exaggerated. After all, there are many authoritarian populist parties throughout Europe. Nearly every country has got some representation of those parties. And some of the leaders certainly seem to have pushed back on democracy. Some of them do not. So I think we need a bit of systematic evidence to look in before and after cases. When a leader comes to power, is it the case that the level of democracy in that country and the underlying indicators, freedom of the press, human rights, women's rights, minority rights, the independence of the judiciary, the ways in which parliament can function, all of those things have declined. And that leads to institutional changes in liberal democracy. I'm going to demonstrate some of that evidence as part of this talk. But that in itself, obviously, is a thin explanation. It's one which the media loves because focusing on Donald Trump or the GOP leadership is something which is very familiar. You can tell a story about the role of Kevin McCarthy, about the role of Mitt Romney, about the role of different people in that party, and the changes from, as it were, the party of McClain to the party of Donald Trump. But of course, that's also thin. It's no accident that Donald Trump got the nomination in 2016. It's no accident that he continues to exert such influence. And it's no accident that the centre-right moderate Republicans have left the party. So in that sense, we need to obviously turn to institutions. And these are long-standing, formal and informal. Formal meaning it's about a legal structure. Informal, it's the social norms behind that. And we need to think about the explanations for party polarization. And again, studies, for example, by Haggard have started their explanation of backsliding just by assuming where you get party polarization, then you have a problem. But of course, we need to explain that. Why would a party on the centre-right move increasingly towards the far right? And what's the consequences? Not just for polarization over policy. In a sense, that's normal politics 101. There should be alternative views. And for example, if the public or a section of the public becomes less favourable towards immigration, if they feel that globalization has not benefited them, if they feel that there should be more money spent on domestic programs versus international programs, that's a perfectly normal part of any democratic debate, and their voices should be heard in the representative bodies of parliament. But if it's a problem not just about policy, public policy, but about the norms by which you govern, by the value of democracy, by the integrity of elections, by the ways in which the media can provide factual information in an accurate and unbiased way. If people don't agree, in particular with elections, then you've got a fundamental problem. And that can lead to the rise of these leaders. And then we have to look at the institutions more generally. And so constitutional checks and elections on the executive in particular are critical for the ways in which you get those changes and challenges to democracy. And then I'd argue extreme media segmentation. And it's not just about social media. That's too simplistic. I know we all love to blame Facebook, and we love to blame X, and we love to blame every other social media platform. But again, I think that it's also part of the legacy media where people get their information from television. When the television becomes also more polarized in party terms and partisan terms and ideological values, and so do the radios, and so do very other forms of like newspapers, then you get extreme media segmentation, particularly when the audience market is narrow and people will only tune in to one source or the other the other source. So you move from what you might term an internal balance within the media towards much more of a segmentation, and self-selection effects then lead to seeing one side or the other until you get essentially two worldviews in many societies. Think about the ways in which we're learning about what's happening in the Israel-Gaza conflict and the ways in which protesters on both sides will see totally different views of reality and will disbelieve some of the video footage or the social media tweets or other information which can cause doubt for their side. And then institutions aren't enough. We have to go back to mass society. I'm a cultural sociologist on a comparative basis in my broad interests. And so we have to look actually at social cultures, the values and norms. And I think so far what we've looked at very much is democracy and support for democracy. And that's been a tendency during the third wave era. Most of us who try to measure things in, for example, the World Values Survey, of which I'm a part, to say, do you support democracy? Do you think it's important? Do you think it's working? Are you satisfied with democracy? And that's great. And the global barometers have done the same. Surveys have done the same. What we need to get to grips with much more seriously is authoritarian values. And here, I'll unpack that in a minute. But I think we really don't understand that there could be genuine popular support for authoritarian leaders. Yes, a leader like Putin uses coercion. Yes, he uses clientelism and corruption, but there is also an element of support for strongman leaders in the Russian culture. And we need to understand that, we need to measure it, we need to monitor it as best we can through our techniques of social science. And then that in itself is influenced by economic crisis and social inequality, but that's not so critical, I'd argue. After all, we know that economic crisis comes and goes. We know that, for example, the Eurozone crisis started in 2007 to 8, had tremendous effects on Mediterranean Europe, but by 2013, the European economy, by and large, had come back, not necessarily in every country, but nevertheless overall. And even social inequality, it's a common explanation, but of course it doesn't really work when we think cross-nationally, because of course some of the countries which have had the highest welfare states, the most generous benefits, cradle to grave, have also seen the rise of authoritarian populist parties. Similarly, if you look at an individual level, support for these parties, it's not necessarily amongst those who are unemployed, it's not necessarily amongst the blue-collar workers. Those, for example, who rioted in the insurrection in Congress actually came from lower middle-class backgrounds in many ways. They were teachers, they were firefighters, and they were ex-military and so on. And then clearly ethnic diversity, particularly in a country like many European countries, which had been more homogeneous but have become much more diverse, has led to deepening cleavages, but then also have cultural issues. So this is the map, and then international forces play a role. They influence, for example, democracy aid, democracy assistance, especially for new democracies. Think about the role, for example, of the European Union in trying to maintain democratic values in the member states. And then we have a feedback loop. So institutional changes will also have an impact on the culture. Now, that's the argument. Let's just unpack a couple of the concepts. First, populism, a term that's used everywhere and nowhere. It's one which is abused in many ways. And the most common view in the literature is often the definition offered by Casmud. And he argues that it's about an ideology, a set of ideas, a thin ideology, but nevertheless a set of ideas. And in our book, Cultural Backlash, we argued, no, it's a rhetoric. So it's not just about a particular party or even a particular leader. It's a way of connecting and communicating. And therefore, it's a campaign strategy which can be used for any politician and can be used by any actor. And it's exemplified by the phrase which Donald Trump used in 2017 in his inaugural, "You, the forgotten people," in his famous speech when he talked about the problems in America. And it really has two components, and only two. Firstly, anti-establishment. You cannot trust the legitimate powers, the legitimate authorities who are being elected, whether they're politicians in parliaments and Congress, whether they're political parties in opposition, whether they're state officials or public sector officials, whether intellectual scientists and experts, for example, on climate change, whether they're the privileged, rich and powerful, multinational corporations, or whether they're the media and journalists, judges and the courts, or international organizations like the United Nations. So the argument is that these organizations are corrupt and they're acting in their own interests, they're self-serving, they're not acting on behalf of the people. And secondly, as a result, what we need to trust is vox pop, is the people's voice, is those who are not being heard, that rightful moral authority, in other words, that there's a claim to who should speak and who should be listened to and who should be determining public policy, and it rests on popular sovereignty and majority rule. Now, in that sense, we might sympathize with this idea. After all, who would disagree that some politicians are corrupt or that some scandals occur in multinational corporations, or that sometimes the intellectuals get it wrong, has to be said, even at Harvard. But even though one can sympathize with these claims, the problem is there aren't many opportunities for real vox pop. There aren't many opportunities for a direct voice on the important decisions of our time. Of course, there's innovations. There's things like citizens' assemblies. Of course, there are referendum. Canada has had many of those. particularly on the Quebec issue. But nevertheless, in most decisions, we have to have a leader or an elected representative body in Parliament to determine public policy. But what happens is that these leaders use this facade, but if they are sharing authoritarian values, in practice, they essentially will consolidate power and you get executive aggrandizement, a very good word which really explains a lot of what's going on, meaning they push back on checks and balances, they push back on the ways in which leaders can be held to account. And authoritarian values, to explain, is not simply about the way of governing. It goes right back to Adorno, the authoritarian personality. And this is an argument which has developed more recently in the 1980s by Bob Altmaier and by a number of other scholars like Stanley Feldman. But it's not been a mainstream part, I think, of our intellectual debate in political science for many years. So it has three values here. What is an authoritarian set of values? Conventionalism, traditionalism. In other words, a set of moral values, such as the belief in God, guns, and essentially the country and patriotism, and which is basically seen as threatened by a wide range of outsiders, and the type of outsiders vary by society. So it may be hostility in terms of race, which is the core, deepest cleavage in the United States, but it may also be other ethnic minorities who in fact may be Catholics or Protestants, but from other countries. It may be, as we've seen most recently in the current crisis in the Middle East, about the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and xenophobia, a broad bitterness in terms of the debates which are going on in the mass protests, misogyny and attacks on women. One can think of cases where, in particular, women's rights and reproductive rights have been pushed back, homophobia, attacks on LGBTQ, and all of these things are essentially seen as outside threats. It's us versus them. And that leads to the second value, security and the tolerance of aggression. If you're under threat, if you are the legitimate voice of your country, if you have a set of values which are undermined by the elites, by the media, by those who are in power, then you're able, and it's justified, to push back. And in particular against them, however them is defined, which is very fluid, means a tolerance of aggression if that's necessary. And turning a blind eye, particularly if the leader uses aggressive rhetoric or even advocates violence or uses violence versus rule of law. And lastly, because you're under threat, because your group is being under attack, it's a circling of the wagon and a loyalty to the group leader, to trust the strong man protecting us versus them. And again, if you read The Authoritarian Personality, which is a post-war era, they were thinking about fascism, but you can immediately see the relevance for any of the leaders that we can talk about today. These are the values which are important. So, more quickly, the global rise of authoritarian populism. These are some of the leaders. I won't go into them in depth, but these are the ones in established liberal democracies. And of course, the leaders sometimes come and sometimes go. Viktor Orban, of course, in power since 2010. More recently, however, in Italy, the Brotherhood of Italy with Meloni in a coalition government. Le Pen in France, always coming second in presidential elections in recent years. But of course, we've got a new election coming up with Macron, looking very unpopular. Maybe this time she will break through. And other parties, for example, in the Netherlands. And of course, Netanyahu, I would argue, is very much a populist in this line, pushing back, remember, on the Supreme Court and the powers of the independents, partly because of his own corruption and the corruption charges against him, as a result, taking his eye off the ball for other security issues in Israel, and a lack of debate about the two-state solution, with, of course, disastrous consequences for Gaza, disastrous consequences for Palestinians, and disastrous consequences for Israel and Lebanon, and we can go on about the regional destabilization. Is there a rise? Absolutely. This is not my data. It's from Populist, and it classifies a number of countries. They're not all purely populist, number of parties, sorry. They're not all purely populist, but they're broadly within this family. Far-right populists, far left populists, etc. And you can see that from 1995 to 2023, the average share of the vote today is a third, 30% roughly. And we can see that that's basically doubled since 1995. I think that's a nice summary. But again, we can break it down by far right populists. So that's the blue line there. And you can see how they've gone up as one of the greatest increases in their share of the vote, although still on average across European countries in the lower house elections, still a minority. What about worldwide? Well, again, a range of different leaders, which I'm going to talk about. Duterte in the Philippines, who left voluntarily, but of course had tremendous tolerance of the use of violence against drug cartels as he saw it. Erdogan in Turkey, Maduro in Venezuela, Modi in India, and Bolsonaro. I'm going to talk about these further. And again, this is not just an individual that we're talking about. The number of populist presidents and prime ministers, that's to say those in executive office in democratic countries, is estimated here by the Blair Institute every year. And they argue that the number is reaching an all-time high by 2019. And again, it's not everywhere, but nevertheless, we can see the sharp rise from around 2000 to 2023. So these parties have come to power, these leaders have come to power. Does it matter? Are they to be blamed for the backsliding that we're talking about? Excuse me. So I'm going to take selected cases and have a look at some evidence, and then we can open it up for consequences and questions. Excuse me, I have a slight cold, but anyway. So we need some systematic evidence, and I'm going to take some of the criteria from Steve Levitsky and Dan Zimblad, How Democracies Die. And for evidence, I'm going to use the Variety of Democracy indices, excuse me, and I'm going to look at time series, in other words, annual indicators from 2000 to 2022, which matches the earlier strategy. First measure and the first concept is that when we see democratic backsliding, we see a rejection of the democratic rules of the game. So that's very straightforwardly measured by the decline in the Liberal Democracy Index, which is more than elections. It's a wide range of other political rights and civil liberties. Readiness to curtail civil liberties, a second measure, which also is argued to be important as an indicator, can be seen by growing limits on freedom of expression. And it's not simply the media and journalism, although that's under attack in many countries, for example, skyrocketing rates of violence against journalists in Latin America, and it should be said in Gaza. But nevertheless, other broader ways in which we can think about freedom of expression, for example, libel laws. Thirdly, and again, this is in order of severity in some ways, attempts to undermine the legitimacy of elections. In other words, the ways in which they are seen as the appropriate way to put people into elected office. And here, from VDEM, we can use the decline in electoral integrity. I have my own index, it's very strongly correlated, but it's a nice measure of clean, free and fair elections. And then lastly, the most serious threat is one where leaders and parties condone or encourage violent attacks on their opponents. Just yesterday, one member of Congress, one member of the Senate, who was interviewing a witness, said maybe we should take it outside. And the witness said, yes, let's do that. This is a breakdown of all of the norms of how the Senate should work, and indeed any parliament should work. And clearly, when people condone and accept the insurrectionists, saying that, well, it was just actually the left, it wasn't Trump supporters, despite all the banners, or when they say, well, they were just trying to defend democracy, that's where democracy comes apart. And so we'll look at trends in political violence to see if that's happening as well. So let's have a look at the consequences in these four cases. We have Bolsonaro, known as the Trump of the tropics, came into power in 2019 and left voluntarily in 2022. Viktor Orban in Hungary, 2010, remains in power. Narendra Modi in India for the Hindu Nationalist Party, the BJP. And we can think about how that democracy has changed under his leadership. And then lastly, the former President Trump. And by the way, of course, that's his mugshot face, but he's also showing that face in court as well, quite a lot. I think it's a wonderful image in the sense that it does embody a lot of the kind of threats that one might think about with authoritarian leaders. Came obviously in 2016 to 2020 with a ... because we don't know what's going to happen in 2024. But clearly in the last few years since he left office, despite some resilience in democracy, the Republican Party has become more MAGA, not less. This just demonstrates how far that these leaders are indeed classified as authoritarian populists by their party. This is from my own Global Party survey, which takes all countries worldwide. We have two measures. Does the party respect or undermine liberal democracy principles? That's along the bottom, that's the horizontal axis. And do they have pluralist or populist rhetoric, which is the vertical axis? And you can see that all four leaders fall into these categories. Now, have I cherry-picked? I could pick many others. And indeed, we can look at the average across authoritarian populist parties as a more systematic measure. But I think looking at the individuals and going down to a particular case really helps us be grounded. It makes us understand what's going on in those particular societies. First, liberal democracy. What changed? Here are the patterns on the annual basis from VDEM in their liberal democracy index. And the patterns are slightly different, which is important. We need to think about the overall, and then we need to think about what explains the differences between cases. In the case of Brazil, what we can observe is that liberal democracy had been pretty strong in the first part of the first decade of the 21st century, but it starts to decline. And that's in cases, in particular, of Lula da Silva, who was imprisoned for corruption by the courts. And we also know cases of violent protests which increased, and tensions in the Brazilian political system. And then we can see that Bolsonaro comes to power and democracy continues to decline, but then flattens out. We'll have to see with the new president, Lula da Silva, how far there is in any way a plateau, how far there could be a resilience and recovery. We don't know yet. But nevertheless, clearly in the Brazilian case, what we see is the decline of democracy before Bolsonaro came to power. So in that sense, he's more of a consequence than a cause. But look at Hungary, and that's a different pattern. Again, a slight decline in 2008, but a dramatic falling off, which is successively throughout each of the four elections under Viktor Orban, until it's really very low. So again, remember, it starts at a high point after accession to the EU, becoming member, but in particular measures against reproductive rights, against migrants, his rhetoric and his foreign policy, and in particular his predominance of his party through the new election and constitutional changes have embedded Hungary in that particular system. India, we can see a slight slide. It was never as strong as the other cases, which is always interesting in 2000, because in many cases, for example, there's ethnic tensions, particularly in elections, and violence can occur. But what we can see is that Indian democracy, once the BJP comes to power, declines successively. And in the United States, we see more of a U pattern there. So a slight decline in the early period, that's really to do with 9/11 and human rights for those who, for example, for anti-Islamic feelings. We can see a decline which then comes back under Obama, 2008, 2016. We see a sharp decline under Trump, and then a plateau, and then a slight recovery towards the end after the 2020 election. So that's under Joe Biden. But obviously in the first couple of years, it starts at a low point and it doesn't go back to where Obama was. Obviously, continuing issues of electoral denialism, threats of violence against elected politicians, challenges to gridlock in Congress, challenges to voters' rights in various states, court cases trying to hold former president to account for his actions. Wide variety of other factors can be seen to say that the decline is easier than the restoration of democracy in America. Well, what about other indicators? Do they show something similar? This is the broad pattern. And just to show I'm not cherry picking, this is another summary of democratic backsliding, democratic progress, again for the same period. And clearly the cases which I pick are right across that left-hand quadrant, but you can also see other cases fall into the same category. Poland, Nicaragua, Turkey, all there. Thailand for a slightly different reason, because of coup d'etat. Benin, because of, again, destabilization, because of Libyan violence, which came down into their country. But also other cases there, El Salvador. The United States, as I emphasized earlier, goes down, but never as far as Hungary, clearly. And then some other cases there, Spain, new tensions over Catalonia, for example, Israel, challenges to the Supreme Court, and Greece and the Czech Republic and Slovenia, all cases where there's a decline, which we can also use. And again, that we also have the gains, and so many other countries less associated with these tendencies. What do we find if we go to another indicator, however? Here's an indicator from VDEM on freedom of expression. Clearly a free press, an independent press, and also social media, which works in a socially responsible way, is critical with freedom of expression. And what we can see here from the VDEM measure is the pattern is more or less identical to the one we saw in liberal democracy. In fact, there's almost no difference whatever. Electoral integrity. If elections don't work, then everything else falls apart. Yes, human rights are critical, and civil liberties are critical for liberal democracy. But after all, elections, as Schumpeter argued, are the core aspect. If you don't accept that winners should ascend and have the power for their term of office, and that losers should basically peacefully participate and accept the results, then the election itself is not legitimate, and we know that that leads to many other basic tensions in power. For example, the proportion of Republicans who believe that Joe Biden is the legitimate president in America is about 60%. Deny that. So there are real challenges to legitimacy. What we can see here, if we look at it, is that there are different patterns. The Clean Elections Index, which VDEM monitors, sees a decline in Brazil and then a restoration. And in particular, Bolsonaro did go peacefully in the end, but there was an insurrection at the very last period, immediately after the election, in which a mob basically invaded the Supreme Court as well as Congress. But nevertheless, he left office and Lula da Silva came back. In Hungary, we see a decline in electoral integrity through a variety of mechanisms, but particularly through the majoritarian arrangements in the electoral system, which means the opposition has real problems in getting sufficient votes in order to overturn the government's advantage. In India, a tremendous decline, but it was declining before the BJP came to power. And then in the United States, we see a decline and no recovery. And there are so many flaws in American elections. I'm happy to talk about that. Sometimes Democrats are in denial about that, but I really argue that American elections are really problematic nowadays. And political violence. Here, the news is somewhat slightly more optimistic, shall we say, in the sense that in Brazil, there was a high level of rising political violence throughout the period of the decade before Bolsonaro, and then it plateaus. Now, that can just be a ceiling effect, but essentially, there was a problem before authoritarian populist powers increased, and then it plateaus. Hungary, very little change. And I find that really interesting, that what's happened in Hungary is that the form of government has indeed been repressive to a number of different groups, but nevertheless, it hasn't used violence tactics, and nor has there been that much violence within society in backlash. India, we see rising violence under BJP, particularly against Muslim minorities and other ethnic groups. And the role of the security forces in that has been very disturbing. And of course, in the United States, we see the sharp increase, a slight decline under Biden, but still at a very high point, the highest point in the series in the 21st century. So the risks, of course, are these: the insurrection in Brazil, challenges to migrants in Hungary, the BJP ethnic tensions, not new, but certainly exacerbated, and then, of course, the insurrection on January the 6th in America, which we're still living through the consequences. And just to highlight briefly, and then open up for Q&A, a couple of the more recent updates, so you're aware of what's actually happening in the United States right now. This is a poll that's just been completed, and it looked at support for political violence in response to the direction of the country. Here's the question. Because things have gotten so far off track, which is a bit of a cue, but nevertheless, true American patriots, which is also a loaded word, may have to resort to violence to save our country. A quarter of Americans in 2023 agree with that, up almost 10%. A quarter of all Americans. But even worse, look at the Republican. A third think that tolerance of violence is justified to save our country. Independents, a fifth. If we look, white evangelical Protestants, 31%. White mainland non-evangelical Protestants, 25%. And all the other groups, as you can see. There's a high level of tolerance in a country which, of course, has very, very frequent mass shootings and threats that are very genuine to many politicians in elected office who now have to have extra security in order to carry out their office. For example, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. And so the conclusions and implications. As I said earlier, clear rise in leaders in recent decades, but the impact depends upon institutions and the length of time they're in office. More time gives them more opportunity to consolidate and to push back. Often these leaders are opportunists, and a particular event comes along, like, for example, the attempted coup d'etat in 2016 in Turkey, and the politicians use this as a way to bring in new laws against quote-unquote terrorists, which also affect, of course, the free press. Similarly, one can think of a number of initiatives taken by former President Trump, and if he comes back into office, all the indications from his rhetoric right now are that the threats of using the instrument of the state against his opponents, his political opponents, is increasing if the rhetoric is real. But politicians and leaders are also the consequences of the changes in parties over a long-term period. The Republican Party had been moving to the right successively, 1980 under Reagan, but then increasingly ever since in particular patterns. For example, if you look at patterns of voting in Congress, the Democratic Party had been moving somewhat to the left in that era, but not so much. They're kind of in the position of many other parties like the Liberals in Canada. Weak institutional checks on the executive, and Joanne Lintz always argued, is an absolute problem. Presidential systems are more vulnerable to this than parliamentary. You can think of cases where you get populist leaders like Boris Johnson, but eventually the party gets rid of them. And of course, there are still problems facing the Conservative Party in Britain, but the idea that it reverts back at least to a more mainstream Conservative politician under Rishi Sunak, I think is clear. And media fragmentation is a third cause. But above all, we need to think about public support, MAGA support, support in the culture for authoritarian values. Strongman leaders couldn't be there if people didn't vote them in the first place. And we need that complete explanation in order to really understand what's going on. I've just given you the part which looks at leaders to liberal democracy, but I've got other parts in the book, obviously, which are about party polarization, about norms, and then about cultures and so on. And all of this is work in progress. So in the next World Value Survey, starting next year, January 2024, we'll get some new measures. We've got other projects which are in the works as well. And we'll have to see what happens in the 2024 election. But right now, the polls say that in America, both Trump and Biden in a general election poll are neck and neck. Indeed, the New York Times poll, which has both recently come out, is one which says that in the top 6 swing states, Donald Trump is ahead, and sometimes ahead by a lot, 10 points. So we seem to be in some ways rather like the Titanic heading for the iceberg, to end on a rather depressing note. America knows the problems. We've known the problems since 2016. We can't seem to change the problem. So thoughts on what could be done within the constraints of any country, thoughts on how we can reverse and make democracy more resilient. I'm sure that you've all got good ideas that you can suggest. And that's essentially where we are right now, I think, in terms of these processes of democratic backsliding. Thank you all very much. I look forward to the questions and the Q&A and our discussion about what we need to do.
Great. Thank you very much, Pippa, for this talk. We have about half an hour for questions. So, and these questions can be answered, can be voiced either through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or you should also be able to raise your hand, in which case I will call on you to ask your question. My request, because we have 240 or so people in the audience, questions should please be concise so that we get in as many questions as possible. And I will also group some questions together to get as many as possible, and Pippa can then pick and choose which aspects she wants to talk about. So let's begin with some questions that have been raised in the written Q&A. I'll select 4. So the first I would like you to speak to is from Mark Pringle. How much might democratic backsliding be driven by national security concerns, consequent to the theoretical model of Hobbesian international competition among nation states? A second question from Olivier asks, when populist leaders and their close allies say outlandish things, like, for example, that upon a return to power, Trump will implement martial law through the Insurrection Act, should we believe them? I'll also take this question from Ben, who asks, was Russian interference in reference to 2016 not election denialism? So I assume the question is whether references by Democrats to the impact of Russia on the election, should that be interpreted as election denialism, denying the legitimacy of Trump's win? And lastly, I would like to pick this question by Tanya, who says, I'm very surprised to hear that Canada is thought of as being at the forefront of fairness democracy. Please consider the existing racism, systematic colonialization, and over-policing of indigenous peoples, which are as strong as well as hidden as they have always been by the Canadian government. So maybe you can speak to these 4 questions in the first round.
Thank you so much, Ashwin. And so democratic backsliding about national insecurity. Well, clearly that plays into it in a number of places. And one thinks about, in particular, the rise of Russia and the ways in which they've been acting under Putin, and the sense that in the period, essentially from the 1990s onwards, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that Russia had lost its role as a world power and its status and its authority. And the backlash against that, I think, within Russia is partly explaining why Putin came back and was repeatedly elected. He obviously uses coercion, and he uses, for example, laws against protests and against his opponents very directly. One can think of all sorts of abuses of basic human rights which he uses. He also uses clientelism, in other words, oligarchies, and making sure that he gives his contracts to his friends. But there is also a basic area of popularity. And because of that sense of trying to restore Russia, making Russia great again, if you like, using the same phrase as Trump does, that I think helps to explain partly why he did invade Ukraine. And he has a vision of a greater Russia, historically restoring Russia to a mythical past. So national insecurity essentially justifies all sorts of actions, and it justifies it in every country. Whenever you see a terrorist threat, for example, then immediately there can be a reaction and a belief in you need strong rule of law, you need strong security, you need strong measures to defend the public. But nevertheless, it's not the only explanation, because national insecurity can't be seen in many of the other cases around the world. If you think about Europe, for example, and where authoritarian populist parties have done well, they're in some of the most affluent countries, and they're in some of the most secure countries in the world. It's in Germany, for example, with the Alternative for Germany. It's in Sweden with the Sweden Democrats. It's in Finland. It's in Denmark. It's in France. So these are countries which are as strong as any. They're the post-industrial society of the world, most affluent around the world. Switzerland is also, by the way, in that category. And so insecurity per se, at the individual level, and perceptions of insecurity certainly helps in voters to explain why people support these parties. But national insecurity, meaning vulnerability to outside threats, I don't think that quite works for many of the cases which we're most familiar with. Populist, outlandish speech. So this is one of the characteristic features. They use a common vernacular, which is using swear words sometimes, but is meant to basically appeal to vox pop. It's meant to appeal to their audience, and it's meant to be transgressive. It's meant to break some of the conventions of nice, polite society and to communicate in a very direct way. I think one of the most striking features of populist rhetoric is that they often use direct rallies and direct forms of communication, like going on the radio or going on television and having an interview, sometimes for an hour long in some of their things. And they always try to speak in ways which are very simple in terms of the language which is used and very direct and very repetitive. I often wonder why it is that in every Trump rally, we get the same phrases, the same claims, the same language. And of course, it's because by repetition, that really strengthens the message versus a more technocratic language. And you think about the language of an Obama presidency versus the language of a Trump presidency, and they're totally opposite. Both were great rhetoricians, both were great speakers, and a live performance that really lights up the room. But they had very different approaches to how they try to communicate. And a lot of what is going on right now, particularly in the Republican Party in America, is performative. And I think that's also true in some other countries as well, where the leaders try to outrage, to show they're on your side, and they're not part of the hoity-toity elite. It's all part of populist values, and they're with you, the common man of the people. I think about Nigel Farage and his pint of beer in his hand every time he spoke, and the way that he speaks, compared with many other traditional leaders in the United Kingdom. So outlandish speech as a performance is true. Do we believe them? Well, the rhetoric in Trump right now is really very, very disturbing indeed. Just in the last couple of rallies, the ways in which he says that he'll use the state to indict his opponents, the ways in which he does say he'll use the Insurrection Act in order to suppress protests, the ways in which he has become more extreme in his tolerance of violence and aggression. And of course, nobody knows whether it's real or whether it's performance. And I think it's obviously a bit of both. When he was in office, he obviously tried a number of abuses on rule of law. Sometimes they were pushed back by the Department of Justice, sometimes they weren't, and the courts. Think about, for example, his early Muslim ban, when he first came in and he tried to ban Muslims from 8 different countries. And essentially there was a reaction against it in the public, and then there was a reaction against it in the courts, which meant he couldn't do that as much as he wanted. But what is also clear amongst many of these leaders is there's structures of opportunity. They try to do things. If it doesn't work, okay, they try another way in which they can implement their particular objectives. And they're often neophytes. They're not that experienced politicians. They don't know how to work with Congress or with the courts and so on. But they certainly have people who seek to enable them to work in ways which are pretty unconventional. You can think of all the lawyers, for example, who tried to overturn the election, and they've now had plea deals in Georgia, for example. And they were handpicked because they would push against electoral norms and challenge perfectly free and fair elections in Georgia and around different states like Arizona and Nevada and so on. So I think there's an element of the speech which is real. There's an element of the speech which is performative. And I think there's more of that in a populist than there is in a traditional politician, a traditional leader, partly because it's kind of a fact-free zone often with populists, and so they make lots of claims with magical realism. They make promises with magical realism, and again, it's part of the reason why they're so influential. Is it's very difficult to know what's rhetoric and what's reality. People in Venezuela always said when they lived under Chavez and then Maduro, it kind of turned their world upside down because the leaders would say one thing, but then they'd do the entire opposite. And so it's really difficult to interpret it, and you need discourse analysis to understand really what's going on there. Russian interference, of course, that was a form. The claims where it's been proved not to be true, that's a form of electoral denialism. I'm not simply saying it's on one side, it isn't. But what I am claiming is that the elections in the United States are fundamentally structurally flawed in lots of different ways, all the way from party laws, control of campaign funding, access to campaign media, processes of voter registration, processes of voter tabulation, the role of partisan officials in states. I mean, I have so many things. I have a couple of books which are very much about the problems of elections in the United States and what we can do about them. And it's structural. It's not just individual. It's not just in any one place. So I think that the problem of misinformation and disinformation, Russian interference as disinformation, i.e. it's propaganda from abroad, is a fundamental challenge as well to the integrity of elections in any country. And it's still going on. Russian disinformation has been flowing around the world on issues of Israel and Gaza, because they want to stir up any sort of hatreds. They want to stir up any sort of dissent in countries, in Western countries, which we see violence occurring in protests. That's exactly beneficial to Putin. So, and of course, China also plays a role in that, as does Iran, as does many other authoritarian governments. And there are some really good studies on that as well, which again have looked at how old forms of propaganda have been reinvented in the social media world. And we're trying to get to grips with what the impact of that can be. And then lastly, Canada. Of course, there are problems in every democracy. I would never, ever deny that. And we need to strengthen them. And minority rights and Indigenous groups in Canada is always one of those issues. Nevertheless, if we take a global perspective, and you had the choice of living in Canada's democracy or you lived in the United States democracy, I think you might know which one you might think might be a better overall in that relative situation. Achim.
Thank you. And I'll ask two questions. I can already see now that we will not get to all of them, so apologies for those, but I'll just go here in the order roughly in which they were posed. So Dinora Aspuru, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is asking, what are the characteristics of citizens who support these leaders?
Right.
Then we have a question from Eduardo Rondon asking, how has the diminishment of class consciousness as a unifying movement heightened the ability of political elites to exacerbate cultural differences between workers as a populist and polarizing movement? We have my colleague Mira Sukharov, who is asking, in your view, how far should platforming extend? In other words, to balance the needs of democratic deliberation with the risk of authoritarianism and democratic backsliding. In other words, aside from the question of free speech legislation, should we as societal institutions, campuses, communities, etc., be more or less restrictive in who we choose to platform?
Yeah.
Tarek, I see it's already going to be difficult for you to answer all this, but I take two more. Tarek Hamdoun is asking, what would an effective relationship between domestic actors and international actors in combating democratic backsliding look like? What are the most effective international interventions, and how can domestic and international actors collaborate? And finally, a question from my colleague Aaron Tolley, who is asking, students in my Women in Politics class are attending this talk today. Could you please comment on the link, if any, between gender and polarization?
Okay, let's do a rapid round, as we say, kind of fast dating to try and get over this. Citizen support, we know quite a lot about that. And we can obviously do the demographics. Education is one of the key cleavages, and graduate students tend to vote more liberal, and they vote on the liberal side. And we know that those who have only school education tend to vote on the populist wing. We also know that other things vary from one place to another. There's a gender bias. Men tend to vote for this more than women, and that's been consistent for decades now. There's issues of age and generations, which we certainly argue in our book is fundamental, particularly in Europe, where the younger are more liberal and the older are more traditionalist. And then one of the other basic demographic cleavages is rural-urban. And again, that's found in many, many countries around the world. And that is a complicated one. It's not necessarily about income, but it's certainly about those who feel that their communities maybe are not part of the urban area, and they're not living with a wide range of diverse groups. They're often much more religious, in particular in the United States, much more traditional in their values, and much more feeling that the country which they think they represent from the earlier era is the one which has changed radically. So if you are a graduate student living in a city, in a Toronto or a Montreal, and you live in an urban area which is highly diverse ethnically, and you live and work with many different groups, and you're likely to be geographically mobile, then you're going to vote on the liberal side, basically. It's kind of traditional like that. And again, it does vary from one place to another, depending on the issues, depending on the campaigns, depending on the politics of those parties, but that's the basic demographics. And lastly, it's obviously authoritarian values. In other words, we measure authoritarianism in the World Values Survey through a great measure that's really old, but looks a bit weird, but actually works. And that's about childhood upbringing. It's the one that we've always used. If you believe when you bring up your kids that it's important to have manners, i.e. obedience, it's important to be obedient and to go along with authority, and it's important basically to work hard, then that's much more likely to predict whether or not that person votes for authoritarian populist parties. And the nice thing about that measure is it doesn't mention democracy, it doesn't measure authoritarianism, it doesn't measure strongman rule. It's all about the values of what you want in your upbringing. If you want security and you want conventionalism, then you're going to vote for these parties, despite the fact that, of course, they themselves, the parties, are far from conventional, often in terms of their appeals and things. So, second question, class consciousness. This is a complex one, but I think my simple answer is that what matters is less so much the left-right class consciousness of the 1950s and 60s, which clearly put the parties on the social left and on the economic left and the economic right. Are you in favor of markets, or are you in favor of state management of the economy? That cleavage has faded over time, along with the differences between the centre left and the centre right, the socialists versus the conservatives, Christian Democrats versus liberals. Instead, of course, we argue in our book, it's a new cultural cleavage which has strengthened since the 80s. And it's a cleavage which has many different issues, which are moral issues: divorce, homosexuality, gender, traditional roles of women, religion and secularization, the role of cosmopolitan versus national values. All of those form a cultural dimension, and it's that which has strengthened. And the problem is that when you get to the economic cleavage, you can divide the pie in lots of different ways. You can give a bit more money to unions and to workers, as we've seen most recently in the strikes in the auto industry in the United States, or you can basically cut back on taxes and thereby give more money to the rich and the corporations. If it comes to moral issues, it's much more of a black and white. And because of morality, because people feel it's part of their identity, it's much more difficult to compromise on those issues as well. And that leads to the sort of intolerance of the opposition and us-them politics, which is so characteristic of what's going on. Mirror, platforms. So, excuse me, this is very much about some other work I'm doing on cancel culture. So I've got a couple of papers about this. And it's also, of course, about what we're debating at Harvard right now, and I'm sure you're debating in your own universities, which is essentially about freedom of expression in academic institutions, but the problems also when people are so polarized, and therefore people feel threatened by those forms of expression. And I'm part of something called the Committee to Protect Academic Freedom at Harvard, along with many other people. And we're struggling with what we should do in terms of issues right now with the conflict in the Middle East. So on the one hand, we do believe that people should not feel threatened, for example, in the classroom or when they're walking about campus, whether from feelings of pressures of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, and that therefore there has to be a tolerance. On the other hand, we also feel that the university's role is not one that should necessarily police what people should say. And to give an illustration of that, the president, Claudine Gay at Harvard, has just come out saying that she does not condone the phrase "from the river to the sea," because for her that reflects, and for many others that reflects, an anti-Semitic bias. Others say that the president of Harvard should not be critical of students at Harvard if they are expressing in a peace protest certain phrases or any other forms of speech, so long as they don't use violent tactics, which and she should be protecting those who've also been threatened by doxing and various other measures and retaliations. So I think that the university administration is often caught between a rock and a hard place, between wanting to express some views. For example, on Black Lives Matter, they express views, so they want to express views against anti-Semitism. But when opinion is so deeply divided on campus, if you do back one, then immediately you're seen as being critical of the other. And so in some ways, what we need to move towards, I reluctantly feel, is the Kelvin principle adopted by the University of Chicago, which is that university presidents and university administration should not come out clearly on political issues at all. That's not appropriate unless it directly affects the institution. So if it's affirmative action and it affects our intake, yes, that's something Harvard should take a point of view on. If it's the Middle East, if it's Black Lives Matter, if it's other issues, even though morally I believe that they should say something, in practice, I think it really can suppress or chill free speech on campus because people are diverse and they have different views. Have a look at my papers if you're interested. It's at pippanorris.com. I've got a new one out on cancel culture and how that affects political science, and in particular, how we self-censor if we believe a minority. What should we do in democracy? Quite simply, what I've been working on since at least 2012. I think we know how to run elections and to provide technical electoral assistance quite well. We know how to provide advice, which is open on electoral system choices, how to set up effective registers, how to make sure that processes are neutral, how to set up and help electoral management bodies so they're independent, like Elections Canada, versus the American system, which has no central body. We know how to set up mechanisms of electoral disputes so that when there are outcomes which we don't agree upon, rather like in cases of divorce, we have informal mechanisms before they get to the courts, or we set up an election court that can adjudicate those matters. So I think technical assistance on elections, in short, is something which the international community can do well. I might say that because I was part of that group when I was heading up the UNDP democratic governance practice. But I think in all my work, I've always emphasized institutional change is something you can change. Culture, you can't change. Culture is fixed. Culture is long-term. Culture is societally derived. But institutions, particularly those at a lower level, which are seen as more technical, can be things that we can help implement. And political scientists and social scientists have a really good role in that. So do lawyers, so do historians, to provide alternatives to countries who are going through processes where they're setting up their first elections or they're trying to improve their electoral systems. And then the last question, gender and polarization. So gender has become a flashpoint, along with many others, such as LGBTQ rights, because gender pushes back on the conventional views of binary forms of sexuality between women and men, binary sex roles between what a breadwinner should do and versus somebody looking after children, and by gender fluidity and by issues of gender sexuality and same-sex marriage and many other policy initiatives. That basically challenges those who are much more conventional and who feel that the family is falling apart as a result of some of these developments, rather than understanding that there can be different forms of families and that the legislation should protect different varieties of sexuality. Transsexual rights in particular has been a tremendous flashpoint in the United States. I think that transsexuality along with race have been some of the two core cultural issues which has lit up state politics and has divided everybody in school boards. And part of this is obviously a debate about quote unquote woke politics, led by those like Ron DeSantis, who want to outdo Donald Trump on these issues, but you can see it in many other countries as well. And it's a pushback. And to me, it exemplifies the point of our argument, which was called cultural backlash, which is to say the 60s and 70s saw a progressive opening for a small group, but then for a larger group on liberal values. And they were very much around these forms of sexual identity and forms of self-expression, along with many other factors like environmental politics and so on. And what we now see is that those groups who were the majority, who believed in the more traditional forms of marriage under God, who believed in religion, who believed in binary forms of sexuality, that group has moved to such an extent that they now become the new minority in the public. If you look at all the public opinion polls, there's been growing tolerance of homosexuality. Of course, overwhelming support for things like women's and men's freedom in pay and in careers and in childcare. So gender roles have become more fluid in the public, but that group who feels that they're being threatened by that in their identity has pushed back. And of course, that group also votes, and that group is the heart of MAGA. And that group, even though they could be 40% of the public, is large enough to gain state capitals, state legislatures, to determine the nomination through primaries because they turn out, and because they vote, because they're older, they can have disproportionate influence. And again, I'll refer you to Steve Levitsky and Dan Zimblat's work, which argues that essentially what happens is there's a minority institutions and that minority group through overrepresentation of that group, which is determining public policy now under the Republicans, in particular, in Republican state houses. But of course, they run slap bang into public opinion. And as you've seen on the issue of abortion, decades of trying to get the Supreme Court to move on that, eventually the end of Roe v. Wade, and in every single public referendum, in every single state, even a conservative state, the abortion rights groups have won. So this is cultural politics, this is the forefront, this is the vivid evidence of cultural backlash, and it really is the politics of 2024.
Thank you. We are almost out of time. I want to take one last question and apologize again to those who asked many very good questions, which we just won't have time to answer. But I want to pick this one from Margaret Jenkins, who is asking, I would appreciate Professor Norris's thoughts about Biden's Summit for Democracy, as well as fairly old democracy promotion efforts as part of foreign policy in many countries, when populist leaders and autocrats, as well as some on the left, can depict such initiatives as examples of imperialism, Western arrogance, and colonialism for their own political and other agendas, or to galvanize their own rather illiberal or anti-democratic support. I would like to hear Pippa's thoughts on connecting democracy to foreign policy aims in this climate, productive, counterproductive, or both.
So this is an important question, Margaret. I'll refer you to my book on strengthening electoral integrity, which is kind of one of the books which I wrote about these topics. So part of my answer is going to be, when I worked at the UNDP, I headed up the first few years democratic governance practice, and this had 60 policy analysts and advisors around the world, Bratislava to Bangkok, etc. And what happened really was that the country, like a Benin, would be having an election, but really lacked technical capacity to do so. They didn't necessarily have an effective electoral system, or they didn't necessarily have the public officials in an independent role who could administer an election, or they didn't know how to, in an enormous country like the Congo, register all their citizens, particularly when you didn't have a census and no official legal form of identification. And so the countries would come to the UN and would say, as part of the development package, what can the UN do to help with technical assistance? So it was always an initiative from the country itself. It wasn't anything that the UN would say, you must do this, you must change your registration system, whatever. They'd never be prescriptive. Instead, they'd say, okay, if you want to do this, let's look at how other countries have done this and other countries which have gone through this process. If you want to look at campaigning, let's look at, for example, Mexico and the way in which the independent electoral body parties helped campaign. Or you want to look at gender quotas, let's look at some of the countries which have introduced that, for example, in Argentina, to help the rest of Latin America, or many other initiatives, truth and reconciliation committees, for example, in cases of long-standing conflict that have come out of that as peace building, or forms of electoral systems. So the UN would help by providing some advisors and technical assistance, providing options, and then saying to those in the country in elected office, and other NGOs and other democracy promoters, which of these do you think you'd like to follow yourself? And how can we help you to do that? Now, did it always work? No, of course not. Elections are difficult at the best of times. Trying to run an election in a country, think about it in Afghanistan in 2023 after the constitution, I mean, almost impossible. You know, because there was no tradition, there was no culture, the warlords, tremendous violence, women were still being repressed. But essentially, by providing technical assistance, especially in what I would term the middle cases, cases which are already going along the road to democracy, but still have problems, for example, about training of the judges for the independent courts, or strengthening human rights instruments, or setting up corruption courts in order to really try to investigate, or helping journalists to be more investigating of cases of government scandals or how they cover elections. Or providing resources to women's groups to try to get more gender quotas into office. And again, we did that, and it can work. We know that quotas have spread, freedom of information laws have spread, human rights commitments, certainly they spread from the beginning of the third wave, accelerated in 1990 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then have continued at least until the end of the 20th century. Have those effects gone away? No. Once you found an independent electoral institute, it often continues because it's an institution. So you can try to create the bones, you can try to assist a country to create the bones of a democracy. If, however, there's no public support, if people are disillusioned, if there's no state capacity, if politicians are promising to do things which they can't deliver, if public administration is corrupt, if the institutions themselves are fragile, if the executives are too strong, if the design is ineffective, I can think of all sorts of countries with an electoral system that is not optimally designed for that country. There are 1,001 reasons why many of the countries that move forward, if you can put it like that, in terms of a transition from an absolute authoritarian country to an electoral authoritarian or even an electoral democracy, why many of those have somewhat gone backwards. And sometimes it's unexpected reasons, events. Sometimes it's just problems in that country that are endemic and we haven't managed to overcome. So again, the international community can't create democracies. We can help provide technical assistance to build and strengthen institutions if there is the will, the political will, and the interest and enough democracy actors on the ground. For example, women's groups or groups to help indigenous groups or other effective NGOs and civil society. You can't simply affect the state. You have to affect many different actors and then work in a partnership, just like the environmental movement works in a partnership between Western NGOs like Greenpeace and particular actors on environmental protection in Brazil or in many other countries. So I think those partnerships can be good. And they're not colonialism. I do think that's, obviously there are cases where on a bilateral relationship, it can be colonialism. And there are many, many other international foreign policy priorities for every single country. And one can see how they come into conflict because we have different values. We're not all, democracy promotion or democracy strengthening is not the only value by any means. We want other things as well, peace and security, stability. But nevertheless, I think the international community plays an important role, and they do speak out and they do provide a voice for developing countries collectively. And they do provide a way of pooling our resources so that essentially we have the resources to help strengthen democracy where countries want to do that. And again, the evidence of what works is mixed, but we can also look at some of the best evaluations of some of these programs, which is where you can find the evidence of, say, US aid, and really find things that work. Think about the ways that quotas have improved women's representation around the world. The proportion of women is still not a majority. It's about 25% in the IPU figures right now in terms of the lower house, the number of women in elected office, but it's gone up. And it's gone up partly by learning from other countries, by learning from the information from UN Women, which has spread these ideas around the world and provides basically one way that we might want to improve our democracy. But whether or not it works is still a matter of a debate. And just the last point, Achim, if America does go down the road where they re-elect Donald Trump in 2024, it's entirely possible according to the polls. It's entirely possible according to the current position, whether it's the primary polls or the general election polls. I've got a year to get it right? But so far, it certainly appears that despite Biden's success in liberal terms in public spending programs, bringing down inflation, bringing down unemployment, providing blue-collar workers with a better way to bargain, and thereby improving equality, 101 things he's done. Despite all of that, it looks as though if Trump would win, with the support of a MAGA Republican Party, which has become more MAGA than less versus since 2020, what's going to happen to democracy promotion then? If the American example declines, the EU plays a role, of course it does, a very important role. So do the Nordic countries, so does Canada with CEDA. But getting it all done and without the American support at home and abroad, and without that American example, is a grim prospect. So everybody who believes in democracy with a small d needs to work for it. You can't just sit on the fence on this one. You have to fight for it, and you have to do analysis on it, and you have to understand that maybe it's not just leaders that we need to change, and maybe it's not just institutions, it's the culture, which is the argument from the book. But anyway, that's another big thing. Achim, I hope that covered all the, I'm sorry I gabbled through some of the answers, but I hope that covered my own perspective on some of these issues.
I think it did that really well. So thank you very much, Pippa, for the talk and for answering these questions in such an engaged way. And thanks to everyone in the audience for coming out this morning, or for some of you elsewhere, maybe this afternoon or evening. It's wonderful. So yeah, this is the end of our event. I hope you keep an eye on future events run by the Department of Political Science or other units at Carleton University. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. And obviously, thanks particularly to Pippa for her talk.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure. Great questions, really nice and focused. And I really enjoyed the presentation and the event and so on. Thanks very much.